I just take a chair's prerogative and ask one question really of Anne. First of all, I really thought that this panel was interesting because unlike the other one, it was contrasting. The other one, there was a lot of agreement, and I think there's a lot of contrast here. But my question to Anne is, what does a successful anarchic movement look like? Because obviously, an anarchic state is a contradiction in terms. It's an oxymoron, in fact. So how do we measure? I mean, I'm thinking about the Maroons in the Haitian Revolution, being very critical in getting it off the ground, and at a certain stage in moving it to a different level. But ultimately, it's the army, it's Dessalines, it's Christophe, it's these people who bring the thing to some kind of conclusion. I'm thinking about the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War, and their sort of central role. But in the end, it's the Communist Party who dominate the Republican forces and the other elements, and the anarchists are sort of pushed aside. Is the sort of obviously romantic notion of the anarchists, does it remain that, just simply a romantic notion, or can it be harnessed in some kind of more profound way in realpolitik, so to speak? So I'm gonna, that's my little question out on the table. And can we have hands yet? Thank you. Yes, Susan. Okay, Mark. Okay, I'm going to start with three. So you want to answer my question first?
Sure.
And then Tim, Susan, Mark. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, one answer is that there is no successful anarchy. And for the following reason, that there is no end. That there is a sense in which, for most political movements, the end is the establishment of a state.
Yeah.
And that's not true for anarchy. And so the question of what would be, there is just continual struggle. And I don't think that's a problem, and it rather diminishes the romance of the thing, but I think it is more reassuring. But there are kinds of answers. Like, what does a successful anarchy look like? It looks like a place where people are living the lives they want to live. Or, how do you avoid the anarchists being pushed aside? Well, I think two things happen when they're pushed aside. One is they go underground. And this is what I think is going on when 19th century anarchists like Berkman or Kropotkin, or they say it's ordinary, it's reality. That they can point to all these practices that we take for granted that are people avoiding rule and ruling themselves in quite ordinary ways. So there's a great capacity in anarchic practices to go underground and preserve themselves in various other ways. The other less romantic, but attractive, at least to me, is that democracy does offer a kind of harnessing of anarchy at its best. Now, we haven't even got to democracy yet, so getting to anarchy seems even less in the near future. But I think at its best, it does that. That is to say, it has the changeability, the respect for individuals that anarchy has. So it is probably the closest thing I can see to an instantiation of anarchy. And you could also talk about things like anarcho-syndicalism, which always reminds me of the Monty Python moment, which I like very much, and I'm totally there with Dennis the Peasant. But those are I think it persists, but it rarely wins. And I've come to think it can't win, and that's fine. That it is a recognition of the political condition that we live in, that we constantly struggle.
Thank you. Tim?
Thanks so much. I think my question is maybe a version of Brian's question. It's first of all to Anne. Anne, at least, I mean, not everything that you said in describing, not defining because it's not definable, but in describing anarchy, could have been uttered by Donald Trump. But at least three things could have, and those are that anarchy opposes rule and sees rules as unnecessary. Second is that chaos makes radical change possible. The third is something you said towards the end. There are still so many silly laws on the books. Now those are articulations of the regime that we have just been unfortunately ushered into. So I want to sort of I want to ask you about that. Why anarchy now, at the very moment when it's the last thing we need? I mean, the other thing that you said I thought that was so interesting, anarchists recognize that dominion is exercised by capital far more than by the state, right? Dominion is exercised by capital far more than the state. I mean, it made me think that the real anarchist here is capital. I mean, capitalism, in fact, is anarchy, and what we need is the state to save us from the anarchy that is, or the anarchism, let's say, that is capitalism. Oh, and I just have a tiny addendum for Amy also, because there's something that you said, Amy, that also could have been uttered by Trump, whatever the populace last ordered. I mean, the version of rule that we're being, asked to accept is some form of arbitrary rule that looks like whatever the populace last ordered.
I think we do question by question, so Anne, can you go ahead?
Sure. No, I don't think Trump is anarchic at all. However, Trump does bear a family resemblance to a set of people I X'd out of here, which is the anarcho-capitalists. And it is with the anarcho-capitalists that he is aligned. And Trump, as I said, every authoritarian opposes rules. Rules are for other people. And Trump is happy to make rules. Who can vote, who can be in the country, who can be in the country for how long. He's a giant rule production machine. And in general, he advocates a set of policies and an imaginary in which people's lives are much more dominated than they were before. This is how you have sex. This is how you get married. This is how you do this thing and the other thing. So the rules thing, no. But there is an element there that I think is interesting and important, and that is, I do think that one of the things that is Trump chaos, bringing radical change. And I think that is what many people voted for. That they didn't necessarily like Trump. And people would often say, I don't like him, but we need a disruption, or things need to change. And one of the things they object to is the intense rule-boundness of liberalism. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. That too often liberalism spends a great deal of time telling other people how to live their lives in very intimate ways. And I understand that objection. I don't think what he's bringing is radical change. He doesn't purport to. He says, I'm going to make America great again. But those are all different. Now, I know I'm jumping ahead, but I want to leave lots of time. Capitalism as anarchy. Exactly not. Because first of all, think of the firm. Think of all the corporate structures. They are the most authoritarian things. The best you could hope for is they have an advisory board or a regulatory apparatus, but they are fundamentally authoritarian in their structures. They're deeply hierarchical. There's no democratic moment. There's no anarchic moment. They're just little tiny or great big dictatorships. And they collude with each other, but even if they don't, that's what they are. I don't think there's anything controversial there. So it is in the form of the firm, but also in the operation, that your worth is determined by how much you make, how much you own. I mean, that is an understanding completely at odds with anarchy and even with democracy. It just should not exist. And I have no idea how to get rid of it, but it is the problem. I'm clearly not a Marxist. I'm much too suspicious of the state. And yet, that is the truth. It's the problem is capital. I don't think this, I mean, I'm happy to argue this out with anybody, but I don't think anybody would disagree, really. It's a nice,
I mean, what firms absolutely want is to get rid of regulation. Sorry.
No, you go on, Tim. Go on. Okay.
Angel.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, you were finished? You just wanted to?
Oh, well.
she just wanted to
No,
get
no,
on the
no,
list.
no, Angel is next, so.
Go on,
she's,
go ahead.
no, she's not next. So you can make your point.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say that that yes, of course, firms and so on are hierarchical institutions, and of course they want to make money and all that. But what they are also absolutely hoping for out of this current regime is an end to regulation, So what they want is something like a kind of a non-rules based order where they can do whatever the hell they want.
But no, they want rules for others, and that is the authoritarian move again.
Yeah.
Okay, so Amy has a question, and then the lineup is Susan, Mark, Will, Jacques, Angel. Okay.
Just to answer what you said about Trump and whatever the people last order. No, absolutely not, because what you can do, the kind of second populist move, the other populism, the anti-Trump populism, is that you can't claim an enduring mandate, right? Yes, but you say, okay, they voted for me. That means they must want this and that and this and that. Well, let's ask them, you know? And you do get, I mean, with any kind of democratic structure, there's the problem of what happens when the people give an answer that you don't like, right? That we, the gathered intelligentsia, do not like. And I mean, Adi knows that I kind of disagree with what Bonnie said earlier about defending the agon, that I have a lot of trouble with the idea that some things have to be ejected and that we can't find ways to deal with them within that. But I do think that the promise of a kind of constantly reconstituting people is that nothing lasts for very long.
Okay, Susan?
So I want to just say, I want to just say that I don't think you can just cut off anarchy from the anarcho-capitalists who have a very well thought out understanding of capitalism and the non-necessity of the state, which is really crucial, and that the country itself should be run like a company. So, I mean, it's horrible, but I think that to say that my definition of capitalism is anti-domination of anarchy is non-domination is a little bit too quick a dismissal of something that's growing as a collective belief. So, I wanted actually more to ask a question. So I worked on the first century and Josephus's understanding of civil war, which is the leitmotif of that book. It's the most frequently used word about what's going wrong in it's not a Jewish war, but a Judean war. And yet, and the way that people have used that to criticize the Israeli state, essentially, by saying that, it's not the tradition of being anti-imperialist, and you threw out the Romans because the Romans came in before this war by, I think, 40 years or something like that. So, I mean, my question would be, you're suggesting maybe that there's a totally different way to critique that nationalist recouping of Josephus's understanding of the collective that could be rent by civil war. So I wondered if you had just looked into Josephus at all as a way of, because that's the first time that you had to worry about who's following whom in the imperial line, and it's a moment of civil war, which is a different notion in Roman history. So is there anything there that you find interesting about the comparison, because I understand civil war in the Roman tradition is not the same as the Thucydides tradition from which Josephus is taking his idea of civil war.
Right. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to give you a satisfactory answer because I'd have to go back and look at that. I have thought about it a bit, but it's not going to spring fully formed from me right now. But I think it is important that, yes, he's working with a lot of Greek ideas, and so much of what I'm saying is I'm really trying to make a claim about a kind of vernacular Roman tradition that is quite divorced from that. But also, once you've got an emperor, everything is different, right? The idea that legitimacy lies with the people is just gone. And so if we're worrying about who's going to be the next emperor and about the loyalty that you owe to an emperor, or the claim whether or not you owe loyalty to an emperor, we're in a very different world. There definitely are points of connection, but I'm not going to go there right now. But maybe some other time.
Okay, Mark, I think you're on the floor. Yeah.
Oh, which way? Please. So,
Microphone.
oh, I'm sorry. Thanks. Anne, it might surprise you, I don't know, but I think my spiritual democracy would really love your self-reliant, not self-sufficient, you're self-reliant anarchists. I think spiritual democracy would like to recruit them. But my question to you is, it's in some ways it's a meta question or comment. So I alluded to my spiritual democracy because even though I did try to descriptively identify figures and movements, tried to tie them to spiritual democracy. In many ways, it's a construction. It's something that I'm fashioning. Again, I think there's some fidelity to what in fact is there, what's out there, but it's very much a construction. And it seemed to me that your approach in some ways was very similar. That, I mean, on the one hand, you did identify certain figures, but this is still, it feels very much like Anne's construction of anarchy. And I like it.
Anarchy, after all.
I like it. And I'm just wondering, I mean, and I like the connection between the anarchists and solidarity. I thought that was really interesting. But I'm just wondering, can you offer more in terms of, this probably isn't the right term, but the kind of, I don't know, the ethical, material or perspectives or traditions or practices or figures that kind of inform Anne's account or construction of anarchy? Because I mean, there's a lot of different versions of anarchy, right? So can you just say a bit more about that? Does that make sense or no?
Oh, it makes complete sense. I'm somewhat resistant to it for the following reason. I mean, when you were describing your spiritual democracy, there are many figures in them that are very attractive to me. Although having a very well-developed critical disposition, I love Whitman. But Whitman is really a hierarchical imperialist pig in so many ways. You two will come over in due time to my side. Really? It's not pretty, some of it. Or, along yet your road, O flag. I can't do it. And lined with bloody death. For the prize that I see at issue is the world. These are a problem. And so I do think one has to, I think part of what you're doing is creating an imaginary. And we need those. We need those narratives. Because I think it is true that that people need those things to give themselves something to hope for, something in which they can see a past that they want to belong to and a future that they want to help make. But no one is going to like everybody's. And I want to leave a lot of space for people. So that, I have an account. When I wrote my last book, my great fear about it was that it was too bossy. because it actually does have an appendix of imperatives of things you should do, which are, it's kind of embarrassing, but they are mostly things of a rebellious character, so maybe, except for pay your taxes, which I believe in very much, because as my partner says, taxes are how we pay for the work we do together. And I thought that is the best definition of taxes ever. So, pro-tax. But, I mean, yes, I can. I mean, I could list the people, I mean, obviously, I love Rainsborough. I like I'm having a British moment here. I like the guy who, when he's going to his execution after the Restoration, and somebody says, "Where's your good old cause now?" And he rips open his shirt and he says, "Here in my bosom, and I will seal it with my blood." I know. How great is that?
Remember that.
Yes, and it is the other side of embodied sovereignty. You know, the side that I think you in some ways have in mind. People die for these things, and in some ways, because Americans love to read about people dying for things, and we love, in many ways, I think, to imagine ourselves dying for things, and we are sadly, very addicted to guns. We like guns. It's so easy. You shoot somebody and they're gone. And yet, that whole moment is such a fundamentally dictatorial moment. It is my will over your body.
Yeah.
And so I like to stay away from it, even though obviously I have a certain attraction to it. So it's the things of the bits of the imaginary I want to put in the public realm. I want to avoid those things, and I want to largely leave a lot of space for people to fill in their own way. Just say, live your life. I don't care what it is. Live your life. But that does raise a question, because I'm kind of sympathetic to Bonnie's kick 'em out moment. That is to say, what do you do with the people who we really can include? And you can say, oh, we can accommodate them. But really, that's just another mode of silencing.
No, I mean, what I think intellectually and what I think we should do in practice right now are two quite different things.
But I think all the liberal solutions to this are generally just another way of making them impotent. And maybe it would be more honest to say, find a different polity. You will be happier elsewhere. And maybe we'll even fund you. One of my great dreams is that Trump goes either to Saudi Arabia or to Russia, two places which I think he would be more comfortable.
Okay, we're running out of time, of course. So I'm going to ask the speakers who are coming up to be a little tighter in their questions, comments, and see if anybody else wants to come on the floor. So it's Will next. Yeah.
I'll save my question for Anne for dinner. Okay, so okay. I have got one. Although I did have a side comment on the question about capitalism and anarchism, is that the firm is not capitalism.
What is it? Yes, no, that's true.
So the question was about capitalism, but you answered it
Yes,
about the firm.
I did.
They're not the same thing.
Okay. No.
But anyway, we can talk later. The question I had for Amy is born out of my complete ignorance, and so I solicit your forbearance about this. I may be barking up the wrong tree here. I'm interested in the populace as a term which is capacious and contradictory, and you do an amazing job of trying to explain for us how we might conceptualize it coherently. But is it possible to think about it in a different way as a language problem rather than a political problem, about the available means of expression that was available to writers in the period that you're describing? So this requires knowledge that I don't have about the way that language and writing shifts during this period and evolves and changes, or doesn't. So I wonder what other terms might have been available, or whether it was possible to make other terms available, or whether there required a kind of innovation about language that wasn't possible. So another way of asking the question is does the evolution of language in this period map on to what we know about its political practice from other sources, like, for example, archaeology or iconography? is there some way of approaching these political problems outside of language, or do we only have the document? In which case, it's very difficult for us to extrapolate a coherent set of meanings, because unless we know more about the available means of expression, which I don't. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, just to be really quick, there are things that we can do with non-linguistic evidence, but probably not to the extent that you would like.
Right.
But what we are dealing with is we're dealing with a world where Cicero does his theoretical thinking entirely in Greek and his vernacular politics entirely in Latin.
So is that helpful? Or
Yes, it's very
right.
helpful, because
Yeah.
clearly he doesn't believe what he's saying to the people. He has a different mental model. But what I'm interested in is this idea of vernacular political theory, which he is constrained by when he's actually doing his politics in front of the people. So, yeah, there's lots there.
Okay, so Jacques, I think you're next up to bat.
I have so much that I want to ask both of you that I'm going to shut up, except that I wanted to ask Amy something that's pressing. So how do you institutionalize, or do you not, given the description that you've given of the populace? Is it possible to generate institutions that have at least the perdurance that a signature on a contract might entail, or a commitment of the body? It doesn't have to be the complete state, but a body, a local body, for instance. How do you do that without a conception of generation or of time that it goes a little farther than simply the actually existing populace?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. But there are so many different societal formations that don't have the kind of distinction between a constitution and a law. You know, and again, this is something that Cicero's trying to figure out in this very moment. He would love there to be some kind of more enduring sort of supra laws. So I think there are many different ways, but I think it's what I'm proposing is just to read into this Roman. I mean, what actually happened is that there were institutions, right? There are things that happen every single year, right? It's not the case that they're just constantly changing everything. So maybe that's just one answer, is that human nature in an anarchic world actually leads us to some sort of stability. Yeah, this is the thinking space where we think that actually in so many of these different political systems there is actually no prohibition on constant change, unless you're going to design some kind of mode of constitutionality. And so what happens if you think that through? Does that make sense, or am I misunderstanding you?
No, it makes sense. I think most things through Lucretius, and the same kind of tension is at work in the law.
Yeah.
Okay, Angel.
Thank you to both Anne and Amy. My name is Angela. I'm in 6th year in religious studies. I had some questions that hopefully tie both of your presentations together. Beginning with you, Anne, on the conception of anarchy, and you gave a list of what's included in your conception. One being that it hates to lead, and I'm thinking of Brian's comment on rebellions and marronage, and continuing to think with that, I think also of the people as well. And you mentioned how it's so abstract, but it needs to become embodied. And you also mentioned the manifesto as constituent power, and you brought up that article, and where it was also listed below, a feminist revolution. And so I'm thinking also of like lived manifestos as a kind of anarchy. But to get back to the example of Marinage and the rebellion, I'm just thinking of Nanny of the Maroons in Jamaica, for example, as a figure, as a leader. And so how do you reconcile anarchy as hating to lead, but there's this necessity for some kind of leadership or kind of leadership capacity for at least anarchic kind of movements to take place. Anarchy isn't confined to the movement per se. It can also be quite subjective and individualistic. But when thinking of the people, and you think of these communities that engage in these anarchic acts and behaviors, and how do you kind of reconcile that? I guess also, Amy, with you, when you think of the people, and you think of the people as the state, but I'm also wondering if the people can also be beyond the state, especially if it lends itself towards the anarchic in that way. When we think of these examples of rebellion, the people, the populace still exist, and perhaps there is state making that takes place, but it's a different kind, that kind of evades sort of the big state. So I'm just wondering about those different dynamics and how you both make sense of them.
Well, it's not an accident that before I went to school, to college, I thought I would study. I had been reading a lot all throughout my high school years of anti-colonial movements, principally, but not only in Africa. And what really troubled me was the emergence of military dictatorships afterwards. And I think in every anti-colonial movement, there is both a temptation and a danger in leadership. That leaders, especially military leaders, you have to have a lot of faith in them. When they are acting in a rebellion, they have, of necessity, a lot of consent behind them. Once the state is established, that becomes very fraught, and very few can walk away from that. So I think that there can be moments when leaders are necessary, and that people have different ways of dealing with it. One of the ones I love is that apparently among pirates, they elected a captain. They elected the captain for that voyage, and then after the voyage was over, game over. And they also decided the rules by which plunder would be divided, and they had social welfare schemes and many other things. But the idea that leadership is a kind of permanent endowal of power seems to me to be profoundly wrong, and that one should have, as the person who's leading, one should have a disposition to refuse that as a permanent gift, and as a person who are being led, you should have a resistance to seeing it last beyond immediate need. So,
Yeah, Amy, you want to?
Well, there's lots there, but the bit I would like to single out is that, yes, absolutely, thinking of the people not just as the state, but as beyond the state. I'm using the state really as an analogy of a sort, because we're in a pre-state world, right? No one's read any Weber. The state, what I mean is the political protagonist, right? The actor. So in theory, where each of these, any constellation of people, or indeed non-people, any not just an assembly but an assemblage, has this kind of total legitimacy. You're going to have lots of little, not fragmentary states. You're going to have lots of little political actors, right? Which are smaller, larger than what we might think of as a state.
Still thinking about this idea of
You want to have a mic?
The governing. I'm just still, thank you. That was very helpful from both of you. I'm still thinking about this idea of the relationship between the collective and the governing body within these sorts of movements, but still sort of the presence of some kind of figure that is sort of guiding the masses. And so I'm still thinking about this idea of what is a leader. Maybe that's not the right term. Maybe you're trying to think of a different conception. The one that you're presenting us with is very fraught. But there's still this sense of somebody who's taking on this role of sort of guiding. And I think it's also very interesting to think about when it's a woman in particular cases as well. Just some things to still think through, but thank you.
I mean, I think my answer would be very much the same as Anne's, in that, the populace can have a leader for precisely as long as it consents to have that leader.
Okay, I think we have Daniel. Daniel, hi Daniel. Hi, Brian, how are you? I just, and you wanted to stick something in, right? Okay,
I
go
do.
ahead.
I have a question for Amy.
Oh,
that I'm
let's,
feeling
Daniel, you go first. Yeah.
Yeah, great. My question is for Professor Norton. My name is Daniel. I'm a PhD student in anthropology here at Brown, and thus I think a lot about how other people in other times and places think about themselves and talk about themselves. And I'm curious about your thoughts on the idea of the individual in relation to anarchism, which was seemingly at the center of your overview of the concept. So we know largely thanks to Professor Wengrow's work that people in the past who we would consider to be anarchists today based their political organization around much different ideas of what a human is, which much of the time was incommensurable with and cannot be understood through liberal and Enlightenment individualism that is at the basis of how we understand humanity today. That is, they quite literally did not consider themselves to be individuals, and claiming such was unthinkable and would be preposterous to suggest inside their cultural systems. We also know that thanks to David Graeber's broader work, that various people today who we would consider to be anarchists in our terms have fundamentally different ideas of being a human in community and reject the liberal ideas of individuality or preserve other ideas of being human while playing the game of being a modern state subject. Black anarchist thinkers such as Winter and Fanon have also argued that the individual's ontology at the heart of liberalism, and thus the heart of colonialism, must be eradicated to achieve an anarchy. My question for you is, do you see a viable path to conceptualizing anarchy from the basis of liberal individualism? In other words, do you see the potentiality in the Enlightenment idea of the individual human, or would an idea of anarchy continuously fall short of reaching its potential through the ways of thinking about the self and community based on modern ideas of individuality and gender? But is this something that we just have to live with and work with, given that this idea of individuality is hegemonic and with us today? Thank you.
I don't think the idea of individuality is hegemonic. Even here, I think that it is, that the idea of community is given a status above that, and that increasingly our sense of the human is correctly one that recognizes it's the human imbrication with others, both at the social level but also at the material level. And so in some ways, I'm interested in recovering and to some extent rehabilitating the idea of the individual, because I don't think it's hegemonic. I think it is a wedge against people telling you how to live your life. And community makes me extremely uneasy. Part of this is probably being queer, but part of this, I think, is just a natural disposition to, who are you to tell me how to live my life? And that moment of resistance to, you don't get to tell me how to live my life, is one I want to really preserve. And I think is at the core of anarchy. And that's why I think people need to be able to leave. Whatever it is they want to leave, they should be able to leave. But yes, I think, and I spend a lot of time, now I'm spending a lot of time reading what I can of different, like the Diné, different indigenous groups. And I have previously spent a fair amount of time on Muslim political thought and on work in anti-colonial India. So I know there are lots of understandings of how people live in the world. And even within one cultural site, there are usually really contending ones. So I am more committed than the average bear to the idea of the individual for two reasons. One, I do want people to be able to live their lives. And secondly, because of the body. I think the fact that that you have to live in this body that you don't really understand, and that it is just given to you, and it's so bizarre when you think about it. I mean, whenever I look at my hands and I think how peculiar it is to be a being that has tiny little appendages at the end. What is that? It's much more absurd than anything anyone could imagine. And when people do it, well, never mind. But that condition, that part of the human condition is very visible to me, and I think sort of underappreciated in its oddity. But
Okay, we're
can I
literally
ask my question,
almost at
Randy?
time, so you have
Okay.
30 seconds to ask your thing. And
Territory.
David, you had your hand up?
My jet lag kicked in, but this young man reminded me that I exist. I only would say that just in relation to the current discussion, your question, Brian, about could anarchism function in real politics, I would personally turn around to ask to what extent real politics before, behind, and beyond the modern state has in fact involved anarchist principles, by which I simply mean people acting collectively and making political decisions in the absence of an apparatus of coercion. And I think once you do that, you find it all over the place, actually. And that's all.
It's a great way to end the panel, actually, by looking all over the place when we leave here. But I really want to thank our panelists with a round of applause for their extraordinary papers.